term. You may not get an immediate response, but you have to stand for what's right for the long term. Maybe you're planting seeds.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We'll leave this program here as the U.S. Senate is about to gavel in to continue work on the immigration bill, creating a path to citizenship for illegal immigrants and allowing additional high and low-skilled workers. And now to live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
Order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal Spirit, we believe, but we need you to remove our doubts. As our lawmakers face daunting challenges, give them an unwavering faith that will not shrink when facing obstacles. Imbue them with greater patience and make them constant in their commitment to do your will. Lord, help them to cast their cares on you and leave to you the consequences of their faithful service. Prosper all they do today in accordance with your will, and with your almighty power, annul and overrule any poor decisions they make. And Lord, thank you for the faithful service of Senator Mo Cowan. Bless him as he prepares to leave the U.S. Senate. We pray in your strong name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., June 26, 2013. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable William M. Cowan, a senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Following leader remarks, the Senate will resume consideration of the immigration bill. The time until 11:30 will be equally divided between the two managers. The filing deadline for all secondary amendments to both the substitute and to the bill is 10:30 today. At 11:30 there will be 3 roll call votes on a motion to waive the applicable budget points of order, adoption of the Leahy amendment as modified, and a cloture vote on the committee reported substitute amendment. Mr. President, I think it's appropriate that I say just a word or two about the 8 senators who have worked to get us to the point where we are now. I was thinking this morning, this is really America at its best. Each one of those 8 senators don't know, as I don't know, whether this work they've done is going to help them or hurt them in their political careers. But this is one of those opportunities where I'm confident that they believe they're doing it for the right reasons, no matter what the political consequences are. We have a broken immigration system, and they have led us to a path to be able to fix it. But for them, we would continue with this broken immigration system, which, as we know now from the reports we got from the Congressional Budget Office, is going to help tremendously reduce our deficit for the next 2 decades by $1 trillion. $1 trillion. When people came before this legislation and say we have to do this legislation because it's good for the security of this nation and good for the economy, people really didn't know if they were speaking truth. Well, we know now that is absolutely true, that it improves the security. We see what's going to happen with border. We're going to have 40,000 Border Patrol agents. and of all other methods to make sure that border is secure and the northern border is secure. In addition to that, Mr. President, it's going to improve our economy significantly. So I applaud and congratulate those 8 senators for the remarkably good work that they have done. Mr. President, it was 6 a.m. when immigration officials came to take Maria Espinosa's husband away in handcuffs. She walked out the front door to hand her husband his lunch money and watched as he was loaded in a truck and carted to an immigration detention center. That's a fancy word for jail. He wasn't a criminal. He works hard, pays his taxes, he's a good father and a good husband. But Jorge is in the country without the proper immigration paperwork. So he spent a month in this jail. Maria, who's also an undocumented immigrant, was also set to be deported, but was able to remain at home with her teenage daughter, who is, by the way, a United States citizen. Maria and Jorge were eventually able to secure a stay of deportation. But they live with the fear that they will be torn away from their family and deported to a country they haven't set foot in 25 years. They came from Mexico. They've made their home in Las Vegas, and they've been there for 25 years, almost as long as they've been married. In Nevada, Maria and Jorge have a large and vibrant family. They have 2 daughters and a son, and now they have an 8-month-old grandson as well. They have loving friends and a tight-knit community. In Mexico, the country where they were born, they don't know a single soul except really an old relative. But because Maria and Jorge are undocumented immigrants, they live with the fear every minute of every day, and sometimes as they waken at night, that they'll have to leave the country they love, the United States. Maria lives with fear that she will have to say goodbye to their children and their grandson. Here's what she said yesterday, and I quote, "When you lose your mother or your father, you're an orphan. When you lose your husband, you're a widow. What do they call it when you lose a child? When you're separated from a child?" There's no name for that, she said. That's the end of the quote. Maria and Jorge's family members are all legally present in the United States. Maria and Jorge's youngest daughter, a freshman in college, was born in the United States. So was their grandson. And a directive issued last year by President Obama allowed their 2 oldest children, both of whom are married to United States citizens, to obtain their legal residency. The President's directive suspended deportation for 800,000 dreamers, young people brought to America illegally when they were children, in many instances just babies. But millions of family members of those young dreamers don't qualify for legal status or an earned pathway to citizenship. Millions of mixed status families worry every day that a loved one, a parent, a spouse, or a sibling will be torn away from them at any time. That's why it's crucial that Congress pass this bipartisan legislation. This is reform legislation that protects and preserves families, and we need to do it right now. I'm happy that the United States Senate will pass such a bill this week. A permanent, common-sense solution to our dysfunctional system is really in sight. It is my hope our colleagues in the House will follow the Senate's lead and work to pass bipartisan reform and do it now. Because whether we serve in the House or the Senate, whether we hail from red states or blue states, we should all be able to agree the current system is broken. And we should all be able to agree that congressional action is necessary. I've seen firsthand the devastation caused by a broken system. But each time I have an opportunity to speak with Nevadans about the urgent need for action on immigration, I'm reminded this issue is personal to them also. It's personal, as I've indicated, to me, but it's just as personal to Maria and Jorge. And it's personal to 11 million other undocumented immigrants and tens of millions of their United States citizen relatives whose eyes are turned toward Washington and whose hearts are filled with hope.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
Yesterday morning, I made a prediction about a speech the President was expected to give later in the day. I said we could expect him to announce a plan to impose the will of some of his most radical backers on the American middle class. I said he'd be undeterred by Congress' rejection of his national energy tax, even when Democrats held commanding majorities in both houses. I said he'd announce his intention to push through job-crushing regulations anyway, but this time largely through the back door, over the objections of many working-class Americans, rather than through the regular democratic process. And lo and behold, that's essentially what he did. I was surprised by one thing, though, and that was his continued effort to play politics with the Keystone Pipeline jobs. Remember, we all know that the oil this pipeline would carry is going to come out of the ground either way. It is going to come out of the ground, whether he approves it or not. In other words, whether he gives approval to the pipeline or not, the oil is coming out of the ground. The only question is whether that energy and those jobs will go to America or whether they will be allowed to travel across the Pacific to governments that harbor terrible environmental records to begin with. That's just one reason why the Keystone Pipeline has enjoyed such broad bipartisan support here in the Senate. And even big labor, a sector that's usually supportive of the President, is all behind the Keystone Pipeline. And yet yesterday, when the President had the opportunity to side with the working class families across the country by approving the pipeline, he took another pass, just took a pass. Sometimes you just have to wonder about this administration. In making decisions like these, you got to wonder if they truly understand the worries that most Americans have to contend with in the Obama economy. I've long warned, for example, that the White House was determined to wage a war on coal. They denied it, of course, but only just long enough to get through the last election. So it's not a coincidence that the President didn't give his speech before the election, or that he gave it at a university that symbolizes the D.C. elite, rather than somewhere in coal country. Should have made this speech down at Morehead State University in my state, or the University of Pikeville in my state. That would have been a place to make the speech, not here in town. Now the President's supporters seem all too happy to admit that there's a war on coal. Just yesterday, an advisor to the White House said, quote, and I've got it right here on this chart I'm asking my staff to hold up, the White House advisor says a war on coal is exactly what is needed. You have to give him points for candor. A war on coal is exactly what is needed, said a White House advisor. Look, Republicans are all for developing the fuels and the energies of the future. We're all for that. We just think that it should come about as part of an all-of-the-above strategy, which is exactly what the White House said it supported too back before the election. But now with the election year over, the truth comes out. And in truth, the administration seems to adhere to a dogma that could best be described as none of the above. Not all of the above, but none of the above, except a couple of things that make our base happy. None of the above, except a couple of things that make our base happy. I'd note that such an approach is basically nonsense, since it ignores what's necessary to keep our country growing. Energy needs have to be met in order to move toward a future where renewables look set to play a greater role, because it simply tries to pretend that it will not take years, if not decades, for these other types of energy to come online in a way that will truly meet our energy needs. In a phrase, it's a strategy that subordinates almost everything to politics. That's why Republicans believe a true all-of-the-above strategy means developing wind and solar and natural gas and oil and coal, and embracing American jobs that come along with producing American energy. And here's what we believe it absolutely does not mean. It does not mean picking out a class of vulnerable people and declaring war on them. Picking out a class of vulnerable people and declaring war on them. I mean, there's a depression in central Appalachia, which includes eastern Kentucky, because of the government itself, this administration. Sometimes people in Washington forget that decisions made here actually affect the lives of others. And I'm often left to wonder, do they just not care? Do they just not care? Of course, coal is an important industry to my state, and I'm going to defend Kentucky workers from out-of-touch Washington attacks, but it's pretty naive to think it's just about Kentucky or West Virginia or Pennsylvania. As I said yesterday, a war on coal is actually a war on jobs. A war on coal is a war on jobs. Coal is important to our entire country. It's critical to the growth of manufacturing, and it's important to our national economy. One could say that a coal miner in Kentucky relies on coal for their well-being, just as a line worker at a manufacturing plant that uses coal relies on it too. And pretty much anyone who lives or works in a building with electricity relies on coal in some way. That's why even some in the President's party are trying to distance themselves from his approach. As one of my Senate Democratic colleagues put it yesterday, quote, "The fact is clear. Our own Energy Department reports that our country will get 37% of our energy from coal until 2040. That's this administration's Energy Department. Removing coal from our energy mix will have disastrous consequences for our recovering economy." I couldn't agree more with that Democratic colleague, and it's time for the White House to stop pivoting from job-destroying policies to campaign-style PR pitches for jobs right back to job-destroying policies. It's time for the administration to get serious about pursuing a truly workable strategy for this country, for energy, for the economy, and for jobs. Now, Mr. President, briefly on another matter, another day has gone by. Another day has gone by, and we're still not clear that the majority leader is going to keep his word given back at the beginning of this Congress, that the issue of the rules of the Senate for this Congress had been settled. It had been settled as a result of bipartisan discussions that occurred back in January, leading to the passing of 2 rules changes and 2 standing orders, after which the majority leader said it had been settled, that we had the rules for this Congress. And then later we learned that maybe we didn't. And there were these implied threats issued to groups around the country that he would exercise the so-called nuclear option. The definition of the nuclear option is to break the rules of the Senate in order to change the rules of the Senate. So the minority, and I suspect a reasonable number of the majority, are waiting to find out whether the majority leader intends to keep his word. Your word is the currency of the realm here in the Senate. His word has been given. We expect it to be kept. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S-744, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 80, S-744, a bill to provide for comprehensive immigration reform and for other purposes.
Under the previous order, the time until 11:30 a.m. will be equally divided and controlled between the 2 managers or their designees.
Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
I have expressed my frustration many times, and more often in the last week, about the lack of progress on getting votes. Now, we have been on this bill for 3 weeks, yet we've only dealt with just 9 amendments. It's unclear if any more amendments will be debated and voted on. We have provided a list to the majority on amendments that we believe will make the bill better. But it seems as though the only amendments that will be in order before we vote on final passage will be the Schumer, Hoeven, Corker so-called grand compromise. This is the one that was concocted behind closed doors for days, stalling progress that we wanted to make in the public. In other words, we lost a lot of time while this grand compromise was being concocted behind closed doors, when even while that was going on, we could have been debating amendments and voting on amendments. Not only is the amendment before us, meaning the Schumer-Hoeven-Corker amendment, loaded with provisions that some would call earmarks, but it continues to promote false promises that the border will be truly secured. You get the impression from hearing the authors debate their amendment that tomorrow we're going to have a secure border. That's not going to happen, and I'll explain that in just a moment. Let's get back to basics. We're a nation based upon the rule of law. In that concept, every nation has a right to protect its sovereignty. In fact, it has a duty to protect the homeland. Any border security measures we pass then must be real and, more importantly, immediate. We can't wait 10 years down the road to put more agents on the border or to implement a tracking system to track foreign nationals. We have to prove to the American people today that illegal entries are under complete control and that the visa overstays are being punished. By being punished means leave our country when your visa says you're supposed to leave the country. Unfortunately, too many people have been led to believe that the bill before us and this grand compromise amendment will force the Secretary of Homeland Security to secure the border. Now, the fact is, it doesn't do that. But you're led to believe that tomorrow the border will be secure. The amendment basically is a continuation of the basic premise of the underlying bill. Legalization first, enforcement later, and enforcement if ever. It's very simple, and it's wrong. People will be legalized merely on the submission of a plan by the Secretary of Homeland Security. Now, will that plan secure the border? Well, who's going to know until a long ways down the road? In the meantime, you have legalization and possibly enforcement, but you aren't going to know. So you end up making the same mistake that I made by voting for the bill in 1986. I don't intend to make that mistake again. Now, we're saying the Secretary puts forth a plan. This very same Secretary is the one who thinks the border is already strong enough. The same Secretary who has refused to even answer questions that we submitted to her 2 months ago about how she might interpret some of this legislation. And she obviously hasn't been forthright in answering what those department policies would be. The amendment puts additional agents on the border, yes, and it does it, quite frankly, in opposition to people on the other side of the aisle. Some of the sponsors of the bill have argued already that more agents aren't necessary. Now, then, maybe I should be satisfied that you're going to have more agents. But the point is, it's so far down the road that don't sell this amendment to me as border security. So let's be honest with the American people. The amendment, this grand compromise, concocted behind closed doors, may call for more Border Patrol agents, but it surely doesn't require it until the undocumented population who are now RPIs apply for adjustment status or a green card, and that's down the road several years. I'm all for putting more agents along the border, but why should we wait? It ought to be enforcement now, legalization later. So why allow legalization now and simply promise more agents in the future? And even then, who really believes that the Secretary, like the one we have today, will actually enforce the law? And when I say like the Secretary we have today, I mean the policy. She says that the border is secure. Then, in this amendment, there's the issue of fencing. One of the conditions that must be met before the Secretary can process green cards for people here illegally is that the southern border fencing strategy has been submitted to Congress and implemented. This fencing strategy will identify where 700 miles of pedestrian fencing is in place. Note that this is not double layered as is in current law, so current law is weakened. The amendment states that the second layer is to be built only if the Secretary deems it necessary and appropriate. Another delegation of authority to the Secretary, to a Secretary that says the border is already secure. Additionally, the underlying bill still specifically states that nothing in this provision shall be interpreted to require her to install fencing. So yes, they talk about this being a strong border secure grand compromise, but it leaves so much discretion to a Secretary that already says the border is secure. Now, another part of the amendment requires that an electronic entry-exit system is in use at all international air and seaports. Well, that sounds like all international air and seaports. But look at this caveat, but only where, quote, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection are currently deployed, end of quote. This is actually weaker than the underlying bill, which required that the electronic entry-exit system be used at air and seaports, not just international. So here again, you have a grand compromise, supposed to get more votes for this bill, but it's weaker than the underlying legislation because the underlying legislation requires biometric entry-exit at all ports of entry, including air, sea, and land. The amendment dictates to the Secretary which equipment to purchase and deploy at the border. The members who wrote the bill were apparently given some secret list of technology that agents need, but I'm not sure if this came from the Department or some defense contractor. But have no fear, the border will be secured because the amendment calls for fixed towers and cameras, unattended ground sensors, night vision goggles, fiber optic inspection scopes, license plate readers, and backscatters. Well, now, obviously, I'm facetious when I say the border will be secured by this concocted, behind closed doors grand compromise. Now, what's not so funny is the spending of taxpayers' dollars in this amendment. Originally, the legislation allocated $6.5 billion for the Secretary to carry out the law. Now, $6.5 billion is a lot of money. But when we got to committee, the Gang of Eight increased the trust fund allocation by $6.5 billion to $8 3/10 billion. And $8 3/10 billion is still a lot of money. Now we have this grand compromise concocted behind closed doors before us, and now we're looking at not $8 3/10 billion, but $46 3/10 billion upon date of enactment for the Secretary to spend as she wishes. As is often the case here in Washington, the solution always seems to be just to throw money at a problem, and this grand compromise measures the success of their amendment by the amount of money that's going to be spent, not by outcomes. And the American people in the polls of this country want the outcomes to be a secured border, not the amount of money that's going to be spent on the success of a piece of legislation. And, of course, the money has to come from somewhere. So the amendment requires the government to raise Social Security Trust Fund. It's Obamacare all over, where the Medicare Trust Fund was raided to help finance it. It's irresponsible and unacceptable. Moreover, the amendment sponsors will claim that people here illegally will pay for our border security needs. Money has to come into the trust fund, and after it gets into the trust fund, it has to be repaid to the Treasury. Where will the American people be reimbursed? The sponsors of the bill say that the taxpayers won't bear the burden. Yet, there's no requirement that the funds be paid back. There's no time limit or accountability to ensure that the taxpayers or the Treasury gets its money back. The Schumer-Corker-Hoeven amendment increases fees on visas for legal immigrants in order to replenish the trust fund and the Treasury. Employers, students, tourists will pay the price. Now, you're talking about employers, students, and tourists, people that abide by the law, paying the price. Meanwhile, the amendment says that the fees on those being legalized, in other words, people that came here undocumented, those people, having not subjected themselves to American law by crossing the border illegally, they cannot be charged more than what is allowed already. The Secretary cannot adjust the fees or penalties on those who apply for or renew their RPI or Blue Card status. And those are the people that came to this country without papers, violating our law. The amendment in the underlying bill will not end illegal immigration because the border is not going to be secured. The Congressional Budget Office says that illegal immigration would only reduce by 25% due to increased numbers of guest workers coming into the country. The amendment does nothing to radically reduce illegal immigration in the future and does not provide any resources to Interior Enforcement agents whose mission it is to apply, detain, and deport illegal immigrants. Just like with the 1986 amnesty, and I voted for that, and it was a mistake that I regret. We're going to be back here in the same position 10 years facing the same problem. The authors have talked a lot about the border surge and their amendment, but they seem to be hiding from the fact that the border changes only account for about half of the total amendment. There are changes to every title. There are changes to exchange visitor programs, the future guest worker program, and visas even for the performing arts. This isn't just a border amendment. There are provisions in the bill that are put in there specifically to get senators to support passage of this bill because they think if they can get 70 votes that the House of Representatives is going to buy into this thing. But I expect to vote against the bill here, and I expect the House of Representatives to fix this miserable failure, both the underlying legislation as well as the Grand Compromise amendment before us, to fix it up so that we can vote for a bill going to the President that has border security before we have legalization. And that's going to happen. I trust the other body isn't going to buy into the argument senators in this body want to use, that somehow, if this gets 70 votes, it's so bipartisan that how could the other body not do it? This body is not the deliberative body on this amendment that history tells the American people that the United States Senate is. This is a body for 3 weeks with 451 amendments. We didn't deliberate. We stalled and voted on 9 or 10 amendments. The House of Representatives is going to be the deliberative body on immigration reform, and it's going to put the United States Senate to shame. So I encourage my colleagues to oppose the amendment. It does nothing to change the legalization first philosophy and offers little more than false promises that the American people can no longer tolerate. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Hawaii.
Mr. President, I rise to speak about an agreement I have reached with Senator Graham on the Hirono-Murray-Murkowski Amendment number 1718, which has been co-sponsored by Senators Boxer, Gillibrand, Cantwell, Stabenow, Klobuchar, Warren, Baldwin, Mikulski, Shaheen, Leahy, Franken, Menendez, and Schumer. And I ask unanimous consent that Senator Landrieu be added as a co-sponsor.
Without objection.
I have been speaking on the Senate floor and talking with my colleagues about my concerns that the immigration bill that we are considering inadvertently disadvantages women who are trying to immigrate to the United States. I believe that the new merit-based point system for employment green cards will significantly disadvantage women who want to come to this country, particularly unmarried women. Many women overseas do not have the same educational or career advancement opportunities available to men in those countries. This new merit-based system will prioritize green cards for immigrants with high levels of education or experience. By favoring these immigrants, the bill essentially cements unfairness against women into U.S. immigration law. That is not the way to go. After I brought these concerns to Senators Schumer and Graham, Senator Graham graciously agreed to sit down with me. We were able to work out a way to address the concerns about women in the merit-based system that I believe will significantly improve this bill. The new Hirono-Murray-Murkowski Amendment reflects a few changes which we agreed to after working with Senator Graham. The changes we made include limits on the ability for certain types of health care workers to obtain points multiple times based solely on their employment. Clarification that there must be a personal relationship to obtain points under the humanitarian concerns sections of the amendment. Elimination of the provision that awarded points for being a last surviving relative of a U.S. citizen. Harmonization of Tier 3 with Tiers 1 and 2 by adding points for English language skills, and ensuring that the Tier 3 visas do not reduce the overall numbers of Tier 1 and Tier 2 visas available. We should continue to increase the opportunities for women in our immigration system, but I believe that this agreement will help level the playing field for women. Our amendment would establish a new Tier 3 merit-based point system that will provide a fair opportunity for women to compete for merit-based green cards. Complementary to the high-skilled Tier 1 and lower-skilled Tier 2, the new Tier 3 would include professions commonly held by women so as not to limit women's opportunities for economic-focused immigration to our country. This system would provide 30,000 Tier 3 visas and would not reduce the visas available in the other two merit-based tiers. I want to thank Senator Graham for working with me to modify this proposal in such a way that he can agree to lend his support while still addressing the real concerns that women will be at a disadvantage under the new merit-based system. I believe our amendment is a step in the right direction toward addressing the disparities for women in the new merit-based system, and over 100 organizations, including faith-based organizations, support the Hirono-Murray-Murkowski Amendment. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment to improve the new merit-based immigration system and make this bill better for women. And I hope that we can reach an agreement to bring this amendment to the floor for a vote. I yield my time.
Senator from Hawaii.
I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
What's that?
Well, let's see.
Mr. President,
Senator from Alabama.
I will ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we'll have a vote before very much longer on the question of whether or not the legislation before us violates the budget, and I think that's going to be established quite clearly. The chairman of the Budget Committee, Senator Murray, I'm ranking Republican on it, is going to acknowledge that, and the parliamentarian will so rule that the legislation violates the budget, and violates it in a number of ways, and it's contrary to the promises made by the sponsors of the bill. They proposed a large piece of legislation. They told everyone a great deal of facts about their bill, and one after another those promises and representations have been shown to be inaccurate. They just are not accurate, and that's unfortunate. That's why the bill is having the difficulties that it does. If it simply was a bill that provided a legal status for people who've been here a long time and haven't had difficulties, and it was a bill that actually fixed the border, fixed the workplace enforcement, fixed the entry-exit visa, created an effective internal enforcement mechanism for the future, the legislation would have a good chance of popular support. But as people have found out more about it, they find that all of those factors are not going to be achieved effectively, even in some instances weakened from current law. And as a result, the legislation is in trouble. Well, one of the things that was plainly advocated in the talking points, and so when you get a legislation that's 1,200 pages and the people really aren't able to digest it, it boils down to talking points. So the sponsors produced a series of talking points that they said reflects what's in the legislation. And one of their talking points was, this bill is not going to cost the taxpayers money. We're going to have fines on the people that are here illegally, and they will pay the cost of this bill, and it won't impact the budget. So we were promised that. In the Senate committee, Judiciary Committee, when this legislation came up, Senator Schumer made that explicitly clear. This is the quote that he gave us in the committee. And this is what their talking points said and what their members have been saying repeatedly. And here, what we're simply doing is making sure that all the expenses in the bill are fully funded by the income that the bill brings in. This is to make sure that the bill does not incur any cost on the taxpayers. It's to make it revenue neutral. That was the promise we've been heard. People like to hear that. They were pleased to hear that. It was a positive spin for the bill. And he goes on to say, quote, Section 6 provides startup costs to implement the bill repaid by fees that come in later. Then he goes on to say that there will be money will be paid from companies and workers and by the immigrants who get the legal status in terms of, quote, their fines as they go through the process, close quote. So that was the promise that was there. And now we have legislation and a score that demonstrates that's plainly not correct. First, the Congressional Budget Office, before we added the extra money last week, or we'll vote on today, before they added the substitute Corker-Hoeven-Schumer amendment, that substitute, which adds a lot more money, CBO analyzed the cost. And what our experts in the Budget Office tell us is that it would add $14 billion to the debt of the United States. But it's really more than that, to the on-budget debt of the United States, which is what counts. But because most of the individuals who will be legalized and will be able to have Social Security cards and will pay FICA, Medicare, Social Security withholding on their paychecks every week, that will incur extra revenue for the United States government. And our colleagues, to try to justify their claim that they are within the budget and that you shouldn't just account the CBO score that on-budget debt increases, they claim credit for the FICA money. But you have to know the FICA money is money that goes to their Social Security and Medicare trust funds. And every one of the individuals who average age now in their 30s will eventually claim the benefit of Medicare and Social Security. They'll draw out of the Medicare and Social Security trust funds the money that they paid in, and statistically speaking, they'll draw out a lot more than they pay in because those funds are not on a sound basis. Medicare and Social Security on an unsound basis today. So they're counting that money to pay for their bill when that money is dedicated to the Social Security and Medicare trust fund. And by spending that money today, you're simply adding to the debt of the United States. You can't claim that twice. You can't claim that the individuals who are going to be given Social Security cards and will be on path to receive Social Security and Medicare when they retire, that they are paying that Social Security and Medicare if their money is being spent on funding this program. That's double counting. And Mr. Elmendorf of CBO shows that. Now, this chart shows that it's really more than just the $14 billion, which is significant. This chart shows how much really the deficit of the United States is impacted by this legislation. The unified budget surplus counts all the Social Security money and all the tax money in one pot. It's one way to do the accounting of the United States, but it's not accurate in this case. It shouldn't be used. It claims a $197 billion surplus. That's the Social Security and Medicare money. But if you take away the Social Security surplus that this bill creates, $211 billion, then the money that they pay into the Social Security, the Medicare Trust Fund, 56, the net deficit is $70 billion. And we have to get our minds correct, colleagues. The reason this country is going broke, the reason this country is so far off a sound fiscal path is that we continue to persist in using unified budget numbers when that money for Social Security and Medicare is dedicated money. It's set aside to pay for something in the future. And if you set aside money in your saving account for your retirement, you can't spend it today and pretend you still have it for your retirement account. It's just that simple. This is a bad trend we've been in. It wasn't so obvious when Social Security and Medicare were bringing in a lot more money than was going out, but now that's not so, and we'll soon be in deficit, and very serious deficit. So we should not in any way suggest, believe, or tell the American people that this bill is paid for. It is not paid for, and as a result, it violates the Budget Act, and that's a point of order that Senator Vitter has made and we'll vote on. But in addition to that, it's worse. there are 10 more budget violations in the bill. One for new direct spending to exceed Judiciary Committee's authorization levels over a 5-year period. Another one, a 10-year violation of spending over authorized levels in violation of the committee allocations. Another, emergency designation to increase spending pursuant to emergency spending for the Comprehensive Trust Fund, emergency designation violation for the Comprehensive Reform Trust Fund in violation of the PAYGO Act, emergency designation in violation of the 2010 budget resolution, emergency designation for Social Security cards in violation of the statutory PAYGO Act, calling an emergency to have funds for Social Security implementation. That's not an emergency. Emergency designation for the E-Verify system. That's a system we've had up and should be able to expand rapidly. That's not an emergency to expand that in violation of the 2010 budget resolution. Emergency designation of E-Verify in violation of the PAYGO Act. Emergency designation that passenger manifest information expenditures in violation of the 2010 budget resolution, emergency designation in violation of the statutory PAYGO Act for passenger manifest information. So all of those represent violations of the Budget Act, and I think, so Senator Vitter raised the one that plainly violates the flat spending limit we're now operating under that we agreed to, and he raised that. And when the response came from Senator Leahy, he moved to waive that. And he moved to waive not only that, but all the other 10 violations of the Budget Act. You only raise one at a time. Senator Vitter raised one. They moved to waive them all. Get rid of it. Eliminate this pesky complaint that their bill spends more money than the budget allows. So we'll be voting on that, colleagues. And this Senate has been, in recent years, recent months, doing well with regard to adhering to the budget limits that we agreed to. We've had 7 consecutive votes in which the Senate has voted not to violate the budget when a bill hit the floor that violated the budget. And we've sent the bill back for reform, so if it comes back, it has to be in harmony with the bill. 7 consecutive votes. So my colleagues who have been there and who believe they have a responsibility to honor the budget limitations we agreed to should not vote to waive the budget. Let's stay with the budget. Let's require the bill sponsors to do what they promised to do. And by right, they should be able to do, is produce a bill that comes in within cost, without raiding the Social Security and Medicare trust funds, as they now intend to do. And that's just the way it is. That's just the way it is, and I wish it weren't so, but it is. I briefly would take a minute to point out that we've had members on the floor recently. Last night, late yesterday, Senator Bennett, one of our most able members of the Senate, member of the Gang of 8 promoting this bill, claimed that the bill requires, before jobs are offered, quote, requires an American is offered the job first, close quote. And he went on to say, quote, that we're not bringing in a whole bunch of new people when there are Americans looking for work, close quote. We're not bringing in a whole bunch of new people when there are Americans looking for work. Well, we are. The guest worker program that's in this bill, in addition to the legalization process of normal immigration, doubles the number of guest workers that will be coming to America over current law. These are people who come not to be permanent residents and immigrate to America, but come to take a job. and they work for a certain period of time, really up to 3 years, and they can extend for 3 years, and they become really permanent job takers in America in many instances. And he says, first of all, you have to certify that an American has been offered the job first, and he claims, which others supporting the bill have also said, it's not going to impact wages, it's not going to impact jobs, don't worry about it. Well, I'm worried about it. First and foremost, we're going to have 1.1 million people. Many of those are not able to work in the economy fully today because they're illegally here. They will be given a legal status, a Social Security card, driver's license, and the ability to apply for any job in America. So all of a sudden, you're going to have 500,000 people, perhaps, out there competing for jobs that Americans can't find today because unemployment is very high. Now, that's going to happen promptly. Then you're going to accelerate another 4.5 million people into the country without regard to their skills, and they'll be looking for jobs also, probably most of them in the lower skill workforce area. And then, in addition to that, the normal flow of immigration into America, the people who will be coming here that we welcome immigrants every year, and we now welcome 1 million a year. This is going to welcome 1.5 million a year. So there'll be additional 500,000 workers a year in America under the normal immigration system. And in addition to that, the guest worker program will double, all at a time when we are not doing well economically. Today's announcement that the government revised downward substantially the growth in the first quarter is a real problem. We're not seeing job growth here. Let me just show this chart about the impact on wages and workers in America that will occur as a result of this legislation. I think probably these numbers are modest. I think it will be more dramatic than this. This is our Congressional Budget Office, and they looked at the numbers, and they say the average wage would be lower, close quote, if this bill passes. The average wage in America will be lower if this bill passes over the first dozen years, close quote. For 12 years, if we pass this bill, the average wages of Americans will be lower than would have been the case if the bill had not passed, according to our own CBO. Now, somebody came and said to the floor, well, we won't worry about that because in 20 and 30 years, they say it might be better. Well, first of all, our problem is today. People are unemployed today, and they can't find work today. And wages have been declining every year since 1999. Working wages of Americans today is declining relative to inflation steadily for over a decade, and this bill will accelerate that. It takes us in exactly the wrong direction. Why would we do that? Then it says CBO, quote, this is their own report, and this chart is in their own report. CBO estimates that 744 would cause the unemployment rate to increase slightly between 2014 and 2020. So for the next 7 to 8 years, we're talking about increased unemployment. And this chart shows the wage situation. This is the current rate. The bill passes, wages drop. And they start going up out here, according to CBO, in year 2025. But they're still going, if the bill hadn't passed, the growth would have been higher still. But now it knocked it down dramatically. And even though it's growing, doesn't mean it's getting back to where it would have been had the bill not been passed. So people who say that this bill will not impact adversely working Americans are facing economic reality here that's unfortunate for them. And just finally, they say it will make the economy stronger. You've heard that. Well, you bring in, under this bill, we'll give legal status in the next 10 years to 30 million people, permanent legal status to 30 million people, instead of 10 million people that would be given legal status in America if we followed current law. 30 instead of 10, and virtually all of those will be able to work, and you would see some increase in GDP, GNP, if that were to occur. However, how much increase do you get, and how does it pair out per person in America? CBO says 744 would reduce per capita GDP by 0.7% in 2023. That's page 14. And in fact, per capita GDP, according to their own chart that I've reproduced in their report, drops from 2017, 2021, 2025, 2029, 2030. It takes 2030 before it starts getting back. And if the bill hadn't passed, per capita GDP would be going up, hopefully, way below what would happen. And this hurts Americans when per capita GNP is reduced. Everybody will feel that, maybe not the masters of the universe in their suites out here that are nipping off extra profits because they have lower wages, may not impact them. They may make more money. In fact, Professor Borjas at Harvard says the people who gain the most from this immigration bill will be the people who hire the most low-wage workers because wages will go down. They'll make bigger profits. But the people who will be hurt is the vastly more numerous workers whose wages will go down. This needs to be talked about. People just seem to be pretty much in denial, and we've just got to talk about that. I ask my colleagues to consider this as they decide on how to vote on this important piece of legislation. I thank the chair and would yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Louisiana.